Shalom, and welcome to Episode 5 of the Great Tribulation. Secrets Revealed. I'm your host, Marshall Masters, publisher of Jesus and the Third Temple, and this 13-part series is made possible by Your Own World Books and features author Robert Reiland. And now we begin with the first part of Episode 5, Secrets Revealed. Well, Bob, in our last episode, Finding the Temple Site, we were working our way through Asher Kaufman's work, the threshing floor, and which you believe is the location of the Second Temple. It would identify where it needs to be, and that was substantiated in part by James Fleming's miracle. Now, this is a really critical issue as to the location of the temple itself, and for that reason, now that we're in this episode, Secrets Revealed, I really want you to connect the dots, if you can, between Asher Kaufman, James Fleming, and Nicanor's Gate, the East Gate. Describe the significant details of the East Gate, and if you can, connect the dots, whatever dots you can, to Kaufman and Fleming.
As I said, when I returned from my first trip to Jerusalem, shortly afterward I found out about Asher Kaufman's discovery of the Holy of Holies on the Temple Mount. And so the first thing I did, I got out my Jerusalem tourist map and I drew a line east of the Dome of the Tablets. And sure enough, it goes up to the Mount of Olives and intersects the Chapel of the Ascension, which is actually Islamic mosque, but it is the traditional place of his ascension. I believe that they're a few meters off, but we don't argue about that. But the threshing floor is a threshing floor. It meets all of the descriptions that anybody would have for a threshing floor. It's about 4 finger breadths above foundation stones, above bedrock, and it is circular in shape, and it is relatively smooth. It's where they would flail the grain and separate the seed fruit from the chaff and leaves and stems. And it meets that description in every respect. If you were to remove the cupola that covers over it and the stones on the Temple Mount that surround it, that's what you would see, a round stone surface raised about 4 finger breadths above the ground, and it would meet the picture of a threshing floor. And the threshing floor and the east gate of the temple, which is where Nicanor's Gate was, a huge gate that was at the eastern boundary of the court, and a gate that Fleming discovered would all be in a line. Talk about connecting dots. It would be dot, dot, dot.
Kind of like sacred geometry.
Exactly.
Okay. We already know God likes numerology, right?
Exactly.
So why not sacred geometry?
There are a lot of miracles about Nicanor's Gate.
Well, then we really need to drill into this some more.
He says that sure enough, as everybody has always said, the temple stood at where the Dome of the Rock is now, and his biggest proving point is there's a rectangular shaped hole in the top of the rock.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 2 things are wrong with that.
That's fine.
First thing is that the foundation stone, the shatia where the ark rested, was not a hole. It was above ground. 4 finger breadths, like a threshing floor. And the other one is, like we were talking about in the last session, I believe, the long axis of this whole rectangular hole that he has found is in the wrong direction. So And I found countless other things.
I'd like to delve into this a little further here for a few more minutes because when there's criticism of Asher Kaufman's work and of your work,
Yeah.
his name always jumps up there. And of course, he's much beloved of the dogmaites. So you're never getting a chance to really respond. So take a few minutes to note some of the other things that you have found in his research that he simply cannot substantiate claims.
Okay, one of them is we know from Mido in the Talmud that the 13 steps that went up from the court of the women up to the court of the Israelites were half cubit in height.
What's a cubit? How do you define the length of a cubit?
And now you're getting into a really...
Isn't that a dicey one? It's like, remember that old Bill Cosby thing? Juba, you build an ark by so many cubits. Right. What's a cubit? And everyone's still wondering, is a cubit an arm's length?
The Moses cubit is the one that has the most credibility in Talmud, and it is what Asher Kaufman has used, and he went up there on the Temple Mount and measured some ashlars, and sure enough, they were cubits in accordance with that Moses cubit.
And Moses cubit is, define that for the listeners, so that people can get an idea of distance here.
What's the length of it?
Just offhand, an arm's length,
it's approximately an arm's length, from fingertip to elbow, yeah.
Okay.
So that's approximate.
That gives us a good feel for...
But Rittmeyer used what he called a royal cubit, which is 25 inches long and huge. And he based that on the fact that finding out that they're in ancient dimensions of the Temple Mount, there was 500 by 500 cubits, and he divided that up from some dimensions he found up there, and sure enough, he came up with royal cubit.
Now, where does the royal cubit come from?
There is some history of it way back. I don't remember who it is, but it doesn't have any history in Judaism, but in other societies, it was used to some extent.
Would it have been common in those times?
No.
In other words, they would have never used a measuring system that was not their own.
Right.
So it would have been cubits a la Moses, not cubits a la Royale.
Yes.
Got it.
Where I really got on his case, and oh boy, he was irate. We had quite an exchange through the mail. Called me an errant schoolboy who hadn't done his homework.
Usually when people say things like that, it's because the emperor has no clothes, but sorry for the interruption.
He has his sandals, but not the rest.
That's it.
First century Israelites were not very tall in stature. In fact, Yeshua ben Yosef was pretty tall, according to the measurements of the man that's on the shroud. But the ordinary, everyday Israelite was a pretty small guy. And using even Moses' cubit, which is like about 17 or 18 inches, a 9-inch step that's not easy for today's 6-footers, especially without a railing or a banister. And I pointed that out, and he said, well, the ladder on his son's bunk beds is only about that, and they have no effort at all in climbing up. And I pointed out to him, it's interesting to note the difference in mental approach between an engineer and an architectural draftsman. The leverage that you have climbing a ladder is a whole lot different than climbing stairs without a banister or a railing.
Right.
Another one that Rittmeyer pulls up is when you plot his distance from the rock that he points out under the dome of the rock, due east over to the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath limit, which is where the Kohen, the priest, would have stood as he sprinkled the blood of the red heifer 7 times toward the tabernacle. When you look at the contour lines of the nice Mount of Olives, At that distance, he would have to look through the Mount of Olives in order to see the door of the temple. Whereas you go over to where Kaufman's position for the Kohen is, it's all in the contour lines. The contour lines settle the whole thing as far as I'm concerned. When you go over to where Kaufman's Kohen would be standing at one Sabbath limit using his cubits, he has a straight shot to the dome of the tablets and anything in between. Big thing.
That's a big thing. I think it's then really important to note that with Kaufman's work, it follows the lay of the land.
Right.
Whereas those that would attack it, their calculations are based on basically a Goyim measurement system that does not follow the lay of the land and therefore is not accurate.
They're looking for what they want to find.
Well, that's, a lot of people do that. Start with the agenda and work your way backwards from it.
Yeah.
I think we've pretty much hammered that down. I think in the next segment, when we come back, question for us there is why Jesus and the disciples stayed in Bethany each night. Let's talk about the leper haven.
Yes.
To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the second part of Episode 5, Secrets Revealed. In the last segment, Bob, we were talking about Nicanor's Gate, the East Gate. And I thought the story was really fascinating that, they're bringing it, they toss it over the ship because of the prevailing winds and the storm, and they dock, and sure enough, this thing is floating underneath the boat and comes up. And hello, that had to be quite a surprise. But now let's talk about weather and how it plays into things, because I think weather, sure to me, is starting to be more of a very serious thing, not just an incidental causality, particularly with the Bethany leper haven and why Jesus and the 12 disciples stayed there, because as I recall it, the ancient Jews felt that leprosy was carried on the wind. It was an airborne disease.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us about that? Why is it that Jesus stayed in Bethany each night when there's a leper colony? What gave him the reason to go against the prevailing wisdom of the day, so to speak?
I believe that he did it in order to show that he was the law himself, and that he had the authority to do that. He probably further irritated Rabbinate by not being purified each time he went back into Jerusalem after being in that leper colony. There's nothing that says that, but I think that's just the way he did things. He would taunt them. He used to call them names even.
What kind of names?
Vipers, hypocrites, all kinds of names like that. In the gospel are recorded where he was talking about weather. One of the most famous weather forecast axioms that boaters like myself know about is red sun at morning, sailor take warning. Red sun at night, sailor's delight. And that's from 5th chapter of Matthew.
Right.
Jesus said to they were trying to test him and trick him and so forth. And he said, "You fools and hypocrites, you know that when the sun is scarlet at morn, there will be tempest. And when it is red at even, will be fair weather on the morn. But you don't recognize the Son of Man when he's standing right before you." Holy mackerel. That's been around a long time.
Okay.
And it really is true.
Okay.
If you're a boater, it's a good thing to know.
Well, give me more background on the leper colony, because I find this to be rather interesting.
Yeah.
Hollywood doesn't do a Jesus film without lepers.
Well, Simon the leper lived in Bethany. Lazarus lived in Bethany. He probably had leprosy also. And the leprosy that they talk about in the scripture is not Hansen's disease. It was almost any kind of a skin ailment. I would probably be a leper when I had acne so bad.
Oh, hey, if you go down to the Dead Sea, you see people from all over the world with these terrible skin ailments,
Oh, yeah,
and they go down there.
yeah.
And my wife orders in, every year or so, she orders in mud from the Red Sea. She's got one little spot on her chin, and it just really, really works and takes care of it better than
Yeah,
anything she could buy in the store. And it's just good old mud from Israel.
I believe it. I was injured on the farm one
Mm-hmm.
summer when I was about 12.
Mm-hmm.
Tongue on a mowing machine broke and threw me into a blackberry bush and tore up my hand and my arm. And shortly after that, we drove from the farm in Illinois down to Daytona Beach. And I went in swimming there in Daytona Beach, and that hand and arm healed up just like overnight.
Yeah, I've done that too. I've healed wounds with sea salt.
Yeah.
Just going out and swimming in the ocean, it'll flush out an infected wound.
But Bethany was not like the leper colony that you saw Ben-Hur, the movie starring Charlton Heston, where they showed his mother and his sister.
I know the scene. Yeah.
Yeah, that was not the leper colony in Jerusalem. It was in Bethany. When everybody would come there for the festivals, like the Passover and the tabernacles and so forth,
Mhm.
they would have the lepers housed in Bethany or thereabouts,
Mhm.
because it would be downwind. And as I say, you're not allowed to walk within 4 cubits downwind of a leper. If the wind was blowing, you had to stay 100 cubits. That's like 75 feet or something like that.
Yeah, that's quite a distance.
Yeah. But they had a lot of things relating to weather. A lot of people make the excuse about Methuselah. He lived 969 years. Well, they counted years differently in those days. As Pat Paulson would say, I won't say it, but they knew about the seasons of the year, winter, summer, and so on. They knew about the seasons of the year. They counted years the same way we count them
Mhm.
until God came along and gave them the lunar calendar, and then it was a little bit different. And later on they had to throw in some extra months in order to catch up with the astronomical calendar, and you know all about that.
Mhm.
But Bethany was the local leper haven. Its beloved archaeologist and General Yagel Yadin for having led me to that fact.
Mm.
After reading it in his article, I zeroed in on it more in Talmud and Midrash.
Mhm.
I have a secret weapon with Talmud and Midrash. I have CD-ROM
Mhm.
that has in English and in Hebrew, that has a complete Tanakh and has a complete Talmud, all 18 volumes of it. I've got it up here on my bookshelf, and I can look up a word or a phrase just like that. That has been a marvelous tool for me in writing this book.
What else did you learn about the Bethany leper colony? And particularly the question that really started this segment: why did Jesus and the 12 disciples stay there each night?
Well, as I said, I think they stayed there in order to show his authority over the law. Besides that, they had friends there, Mary and Martha
Mhm.
and Lazarus, and probably other friends as well. And they were out of towners, and Jerusalem at that time of the year was crowded, full. Every spare room was probably rented out.
Okay, let's say, did Jesus do this because he understood something about leprosy, or was it just something that Jesus was doing it to basically say, hey, I can come down here because I'm the boss and I can turn this on or off, and you can't?
Exactly. From my reading and studying, that is the conclusion that I make for your question. Why did they stay in Bethany every night? But the other one is a practical reason, is that Jerusalem was probably full up. There was no room at the inn, as they say.
No room at the inn. Well, then that means time to get a hotel. Time. And when you think about the hotel, at least here in the U.S., if Jesus were in Washington, he'd be staying where? At the Watergate, right? If he was in Washington.
We're going to talk.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about the Watergate. Why is the Southeast Gate named Watergate? I'm kind of curious about that.
That's the same question that one of the rabbis asked in the Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
Wherefore comes the name for the Watergate? And another rabbi answered him, one who had read the scriptures, by the way, said that it comes from the fact that that is where the living waters will emanate from, according to Zechariah 14:8, when he says that when Messiah stands on the Mount of Olives, it will cleave in the midst thereof, and living waters will emanate and extend from the Hinder Sea to the Nearer Sea. We had talked about En-Gedi is going to become a commercial fishing village.
Mm-hmm.
It so happens that the Dome of the Rock is going to be river bottom because there's a fault line that runs through there. And guess what? When that happens, that's where it's going to be, through the midst thereof of the Mount of Olives. If you look at a contour map, you will see that. It's obvious.
If you're talking about the Dome of the Rock is going to get flattened by the earthquake.
More than flattened.
I mean, the whole Temple Mount then.
No, it's going to be cut in half. There's going to be a river of living water come right out of what it says is the right side of the house.
Okay.
In other words, the temple will be north of where the Dome of the Rock is, north of where this water is going to come from.
Okay.
The gate is on the right side of the house, and that's where the water will come from. And another clue on this, it tells that there will not be a court of the Gentiles because it won't be necessary. Everybody will be worshiping the same God and the sound of the same measures.
Okay.
So they won't have to have the court of the Gentiles, from which in the Second Temple era, they had a big sign up there. If you go beyond here, you are going to be toast.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the Watergate itself, I mean, who coined the term Watergate?
I don't know. Rabbi asked, wherefore comes the name of the Watergate? But the other rabbi told him it's because the water is going to emanate from the right side of the house. And so that's evidently the reason they named it the Watergate. At least that's what the rabbi says.
Okay. But a Watergate in my mind is, I'm seeing a device that's blocking water flow or redirecting it.
No.
I guess what I'm trying to get at
is... It's not an adjective, it's a noun.
All right. So it's being used here as a noun.
Yeah.
We don't know what the etymology of the noun is.
Well, the water is going to come from the vicinity of that gate, just to the south of it.
Okay.
Because of Zechariah's prophecy in 14, verse 8.
Well, why don't we do this? Let's pick up with the Watergate in the next segment, because I want to get into having you describe the events that are going to result at the Watergate.
Yeah.
To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the third and final part of Episode 5, Secrets Revealed. All right, I want to continue on now, Bob, with the Watergate. And what we want to do is focus on the events that are going to be swirling around the Watergate. Give us an idea of that.
Well, let's use your term again by connecting the dots.
Okay.
If you look at a contoured map, as I mentioned earlier, of Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. Zechariah predicts that a Messiah arrives.
Mm-hmm.
The mount shall cleave in the midst thereof, and living waters will emanate from the right side of the house. Now, that phrase implies that there will be a temple standing there when Messiah comes. We just answered an earlier question, didn't we?
We did, but I'm curious about this because you're saying it's going to cleave. Did you do any geological analysis on the Temple Mount with a focus on fault lines, either dormant or active?
Yes. Geologists have confirmed that there is a fault line through there. Oil exploration geologists were the first ones to find this. This was several decades ago. And I remember at the time, some evangelicals said, well, imagine that. As if we didn't know.
Hello, hello, hello.
But the geologists have also said, and I included references in my book,
Mm-hmm.
they say that the topography of the area has changed very little, if any, since the first century, even including the rock slides and minor earthquakes that they've had in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And they've confirmed this by the age of the rocks that they see at certain levels,
Mm-hmm.
strata exploration.
Mm-hmm.
So they have great confidence that what we're seeing now is what it was in the first century.
Okay. I want to go back to the fault lines because I'm really fascinated with this,
All right.
the cleaving word that you're using. Okay. I mean, a cleaving word really,
That's good work.
it's a good word, but you're talking about a shear fracture. You're talking about not where there's a settling, but I mean, this is something where if it cleaves, all right, it looks like God took a huge axe and went chop right through the center of town.
Exactly.
That is a cleave,
That's right.
So did you get any specifics on this underlying fault structure?
There are a couple of things that tell us this will be cleavage, no pun intended. Right now, the Muslim Arab town of Etur, which means the mountain,
Mm-hmm.
sits at the at the summit of the Mount of Olives, and right in line with Asher Kaufman's location on the Mifkat altar, which is right east of his Dome of the Rock, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Now, think about this, and if you can picture it in your mind, the Jerusalem Cemetery has been there for probably over 1,000 years.
All right.
And it is south of where this line that we're speaking of is. And
Right.
so wealthy Jews nowadays who pay up to $80,000 for a little place to put their ossuary containing their bones,
Mm-hmm.
they're south of that line because you don't want to be on that line when he comes because it's going to open up and you'll be swallowed up into the earth into a big river that
Whoa.
passes by the right side of the house.
This is a big, big quake event to do something like this.
Oh, yeah.
And you sure would be interested to do more research on those fault lines that are underneath there. Tell us more about the events.
When Messiah alights on the Mount of Olives,
Mm-hmm.
and that cleave in the midst thereof occurs, it will open up across the Temple Mount as well,
Mm-hmm.
at least partway into the city, I would expect. I'm speculating here. I don't think it's going to cut Jerusalem in half. There's nothing that says that. But anyway, it does say that the water is going to emanate from the right side of the house, and that's why they call that the water gate.
Mm-hmm.
So the cleave, as we describe it, would extend from near the Dome of the Rock, between the Dome of the Rock and where the water gate would be, which would be east of the tablets, some distance.
Give us an idea of what you think that distance is. You're talking about a really powerful fracture.
The length of the cleave?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay. It would be about a couple of miles
Whoa.
because on the backside of the Mount of Olives, it descends back down to a lower level, similar to the depth of the Kidron Valley.
Mm-hmm.
It says the water will extend from Hinder Sea to the Nearer Sea, and that means from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates River. But it's apparently going to come from a huge aquifer that's under the right side of the house where the water gate would be. And sure enough, recently, Israeli geologists have found an aquifer they say is of interminable volume. It's so huge,
Wow.
they can't put a limit on it.
Wow.
There's a lots of water down there,
Wow.
and it's going to come up when that earthquake occurs. And that earthquake is going to be worldwide. There will not be a wall standing.
Wow. Wow. If that's a worldwide earthquake, man, that's an event we haven't even experienced yet.
That's before Messiah arrives.
Wow. Anything else that happens before Messiah arrives in relationship to anything that we've discussed so far in this episode?
Well, this relates a little bit to the Jewish rapture we talked about earlier, because God tells them that He's going to bring them to Jerusalem on Rosh Hashanah. That's 10 days before the Messiah will arrive. And the people that are down in Poughkeepsie, New York, or Southampton, South Africa, say, "Hey, wait a minute. It says we're going to break through the soil and rise. You mean I got to burrow through the earth to Jerusalem? That's going to be painful and very difficult." And the rabbis say, "No, no, 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 not to worry. We'll give you some soil from the Mount of Olives, and you can sprinkle that on the shroud over your body on the grave. And a deal is a deal, right? The Mount of Olives, you'll break through the soil on the Mount of Olives, and you'll go to Jerusalem through the air." And that's sort of the way God describes it in the prophecies. Prophecies, plural. There are several of them, about 4 or 5 of them. 2 of them are in the book of Isaiah.
Okay.
The great trumpet will sound, the shofar.
Mm-hmm.
I will bring thee up out of thy graves, and I'll say to the east, "Give up my people." I will say to the north, "Let my people come." And He's going to gather up all the Jews living and dead, the righteous Jews, the ones whose names are inscribed in the book will be what they call the elect, righteous Jews who are inscribed in the book of life. And they will be taken to Jerusalem, like what I call the Jewish rapture. I think that's one of the most wonderful passages in the Bible. I just discovered it not too long ago, well, when I was writing the book.
Mm-hmm.
Comes from reading the Bible. Duh.
All right, Bob. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the 3 veils in the Second Temple, specifically which veil the centurion saw, as it stated, rent in twain. And it's a short one, but let's cover it.
The veil is really not what we would call a veil. It was actually a Babylonian curtain, and it was as thick as a man's hand. And it took 300 priests to lift it and to immerse it in water to clean it. It was extremely heavy. That is the veil that the centurion saw rent in twain. However, there are 2 more veils separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place. Unlike Solomon's temple, in Solomon's temple, and of course in the tabernacle, they only had 1 veil that separated the 2 chambers. But my theory is, and I wrote about it in the book, that the reason the centurion and his men were terrified, I mean, it says in Matthew 27:51 through 55, and when they saw those things that happened, they were terrified, and they said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." You mean to tell me that Roman foot soldiers are going to be scared by a little earthquake and some graves that were opened and a veil over there on the Jews' temple split in two. Come on. When that veil split in two, my rationalization is that it also caused the other two veils separating the Holy of Holies from the holy place, either their lintels collapsed or they also rent in twain, and the glory of the Lord, Shekinah, brilliant light, brighter than the light of the sun, shone through there. Otherwise, they would not have been able to see that the veil was rent in twain. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're facing into the sun, and there's a big porch, 20 feet square, over the door, and it would be black in the shade. They wouldn't be able to see that unless the light were shining through it.
Mm-hmm.
Then they would know that the veil had been rent in twain. They couldn't go into the temple and see it after chow that evening. There's no other way that they could have seen it unless they were standing at the place of the Mifkat altar. That's the only place on earth that a person can stand and see the veil of the temple, of the Babylonian curtain that covered the door, when the east gate is open, when Nicanor's gate is open, as it is on the first day of the month and on feast days. So they had to be standing at that same place. And so, therefore, I could take you to where the cross stood tomorrow, based on that fact. Because I believe that Asher Kaufman is correct in having located the threshing floor. What a masterful book it is.
Okay. Well, then let's do this. In our next episode, I want to pick up with the veils.
Yeah.
Talk a little more about them, how they were actually made, and 72 cords, 22 threads. And we'll do that in our next episode, Most Amazing Prophecy.
Yeah.
This concludes Episode 5, Secrets Revealed. Next up, please join us for Episode 6, The Most Amazing Prophecy. To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com.
There are a lot of miracles about Nicanor's gate.
Well, then we really need to drill into this some more.
He says that sure enough, as everybody has always said, the temple stood at where the Dome of the Rock is now, and his biggest proving point is there's a rectangular-shaped hole in the top of the rock.
Mm-hmm.
Well, two things are wrong with that.
That's fine.
First thing is that the foundation stone, the Shatia, where the ark rested, was not a hole. It was above ground. 4 finger breadths, like a threshing floor. And the other one is, like we were talking about in the last session, I believe, the long axis of this whole rectangular hole that he has found is in the wrong direction. So, and I've found countless other things.
I'd like to delve into this a little further here for a few more minutes, because when there's criticism of Asher Kaufman's work and of your work, his name always jumps up there. And of course, he's much beloved of the Dogmaites. So you're never getting a chance to really respond. So take a few minutes to note some of the other things that you have found in his research that he simply cannot substantiate itself. And for that reason, now that we're in this episode, Secrets Revealed, I really want you to connect the dots, if you can, between Asher Kaufman, James Fleming, and Nicanor's Gate, the East Gate. Describe the significant details of the East Gate, and if you can, connect the dots, whatever dots you can, to Kaufman and Fleming.
As I said, when I returned from my first trip to Jerusalem, shortly afterward, I found out about Asher Kaufman's discovery of the Holy of Holies on the Temple Mount. And so the first thing I did, I got out my Jerusalem tourist map and I drew a line east of the Dome of the Tablets. And sure enough, it goes up to the Mount of Olives and intersects the Chapel of the Ascension, which is actually Islamic mosque, but it is the traditional place of his ascension. I believe that they're a few meters off, but we don't argue about that. But the threshing floor is a threshing floor. It meets all
claims.
Okay, one of them is we know from Mido in the Talmud that the 13 steps that went up from the court of the women up to the court of the Israelites were half cubit in height.
What's a cubit? How do you define the length of a cubit?
And now you're getting into a really...
Isn't that a dicey one? It's like, remember that old Bill Cosby thing? Juba. You build an ark by so many cubits. Right. What's a cubit? And everyone's still wondering, is a cubit an arm's length?
The Moses cubit is the one that has the most credibility in Talmud, and it is what Asher Kaufman has used, and he went up there on the Temple Mount and measured some ashlars, and sure enough, they were cubits in accordance with that Moses cubit.
And Moses cubit is, define that for the listeners, so that people can get an idea of distance here.
What's the length of it?
Just offhand, an arm's length,
it's approximately an arm's length, from fingertip to elbow, yeah.
Okay.
That's approximate.
That gives us a good feel for...
But Rittmeyer used what he called all of the descriptions that anybody would have for a threshing floor. It's about 4 finger breadths above foundation stones, above bedrock. And it is circular in shape, and it is relatively smooth. It's where they would flail the grain and separate the seed fruit from the chaff and leaves and stems. And it meets that description in every respect. If you were to remove the cupola that covers over it and the stones on the Temple Mount that surround it, that's what you would see, a round stone surface raised about 4 finger breadths above the ground, and it would meet the picture of a threshing floor. And the threshing floor and the east gate of the temple, which is where Nicanor's gate was, a huge gate that was at the eastern boundary of the court, and a gate that Fleming discovered would all be in a line. Talk about connecting dots. It would be dot, dot, dot.
Kind of like sacred geometry.
Exactly.
Okay. We already know God likes numerology, right?
Exactly.
So why not sacred geometry?
Shalom, and welcome to Episode 5 of The Great Tribulation. Secrets Revealed. I'm your host, Marshall Masters, publisher of Jesus and the Third Temple, and this 13-part series is made possible by Your Own World Books and features author Robert Reiland. And now we begin with the first part of Episode 5, Secrets Revealed.
Well, Bob, in our last episode, Finding the Temple Site, we were working our way through Asher Kaufman's work, the threshing floor, and which you believe is the location of the Second Temple. It would identify where it needs to be, and that was substantiated in part by James Fleming's miracle. Now, this is a really critical issue. as to the location of the temple